We are back. Another casual chat. First and foremost, apologies for missing last week. There was a minor poultry-related catastrophe which we had to resolve. So, in conclusion to that whole affair, ducks are superior to chickens. No, I will not elaborate. So, today we are talking about myth and how it affects our sort of perceptions of things in general, I suppose. There's going to be a particular way in which I take this, but I suppose I encourage people to talk about myth in general and how it affects the wider world.
I feel like the most common association people have for the idea of a myth is along the lines of ancient myth, like Egyptian myth, Greek myth, Roman myth, not necessarily modern day myth. I think the most closest to modern, and this is like, and I am talking a massive centuries gap here, the closest thing you get to modern when it comes to, I think, the general public perception of a myth is like, you're talking like Arthurian or the Saints, at least from a Eurocentric view.
Yes, I suppose. Or more generally, it kind of fits into, when you talk about myth, it's something that is pseudo-historical, usually. That would be probably a good place to sort of ground this whole conversation. It's something that is claimed to be historical, but there is... looking at it from a more modern perspective, we would treat those kinds of things quite skeptically. Or alternatively, that there may be reasons to doubt the story's veracity in its entirety, but it's still sort of accepted as something that is valuable to be told for, perhaps slightly different reasons. Fair definition?
I believe so, and I just wanted to add, as much when you say that it's important, it feels like they're stories that are important to tell. It's also, I think, it's usually, maybe it's not usually accepted, but I do think there's a good grounds to believe that the myth somewhere along the lines is based on fact and then exaggeration happened.
Yeah, quite possibly. Or alternatively, another way of looking at it would be that if we're looking at it in that historical sense, then you might be talking about something that is grounded in history but is an amalgamation of multiple different historical entities. So, for example, you might talk about Sun Tzu as being in this... It doesn't quite fulfill this same category of myth, but Sun Tzu being a character who perhaps existed, perhaps didn't, but one of the theories that I've seen is that he is a combination of the writings of a number of different Chinese writers on strategy and military theory in general, and they all combined their works together to create the art of war, and then credited it to Sun Tzu, who may or may not have actually existed.
Don't they say the same about Socrates as well?
I haven't heard the case in regards to Socrates. What do you know about that? Anything more, or is it just that?
Basically just that. So they sort of view him as just the character that they all happen to be writing about, and he's the placeholder for, if you need someone to voice your philosophical ideas, you put Socrates in there.
As a persona, he fulfills a place almost like a slightly more high-class Diogenes. That does kind of seem like there might be a little bit of an archetype in there, like the archetypal philosophe, I suppose, as someone, a lover of knowledge, someone who is not seeking knowledge for gain, because he's obviously not getting gain from it in any particular way, but somebody who is genuinely looking around to try and find the truth. Although it is strange in the context of knowing more about the other pre-Socratics and having some of their works be able to be accredited to them, but then not in regards to Socrates, or... Yeah, I don't know.
Let's not allow ourselves to get sidetracked by talking about whether or not these, like, Socrates or existed or whatever. We were speaking of myth originally.
Yeah, okay, to backtrack, we've got our definition of what a myth is in this context. So I would propose that in a lot of these cases, myths are used as a frame to contextualize other things, either about the present or about some particular place or some space or some time, and that is then used as a stand-in for, let's say, more rigorous history, or it's used as like sort of an intellectual shorthand to be able to have a common set of reference points about certain topics within this framework, either of a time, of a place, or something like that.
To maybe help simplify that then, so it's not a paragraph for a description. I would, in my own little bit of writing, I basically called this concept the founding myth, because obviously there are loads of myths around there, but that doesn't mean you base your civilization, society, moral code on those. You tend to pick one or two, and that becomes your foundation for your ideals.
Yeah, so I suppose it's referring to, it's talking about myths as more cultural touchstones, which are describing concepts and ideals in a way of or in the medium of oral story tradition, rather than necessarily things that actually happened, for example. Not necessarily, though. Am I getting you right?
Storytellers and poets.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're pretty much on the right track, but I wanted to add in this extra dimension of sort of a non-political way of viewing things, because part of the reason why I also thought that this would be a good topic to discuss now is because we were talking recently, Kurtz, about some of the myths that you'd encountered recently and been talking about with regards to some of the Welsh myths. In those cases, it's very much more tied to, yes, there's a historical component, but there really isn't that much in the way of like a judgment to be drawn out of it necessarily, as much as it is just, to say, look at these people, like, for example, King Arthur, look how much of a badass he is, and look how that ties to the place in which we're inhabiting.
Yes, that was something that I was reading up on recently. I saw some shows about it and then looked into it further. It was a book called the Mabinogion. I think I'm pronouncing that right, but it is a Welsh word, so yeah, make of that what you will. It's mostly just a lot of the stories rely on a lot of Welsh landmarks, like particular like forests, mountains, oddly shaped stones that people would have come across in just their day-to-day lives. It's partially creation myth in the sense of trying to explain how that place came to be, and partially just it's kind of hard to describe them without going into the exact details of the stories told, and that in of itself is difficult because ancient writing does not follow a lot of what we would consider to be writing norms today. The plot structure is all over the place and stuff just seems to happen for no reason, and it, as a modern reader, it can be kind of confusing. Stories seem to just trail on and on and on and take weird twists and turns, and ultimately, most of the time, don't end up going anywhere in particular. Sometimes it's difficult even to draw a moral lesson out of them.
Well, let's go to a more specific example then, because the one that you were explaining is quite interesting and takes us in a slightly different direction. In that it sounded very reminiscent of the Trials of Hercules. Could you unpack that one a little bit?
Yes, right. It's first of all interesting because it's the first recorded mention of King Arthur in any piece of literature. I don't remember any of the character names, so this is going to get kind of awkward.
I'll add it into the description after the fact.
Wonderful. The story revolves around a princess who is the most beautiful woman in the land, and there is a man, I think his name is Olwen, but I don't remember, who is trying to court her. But her father, who is a Welsh king, and is a giant who will die the moment she is wed. So Olwen asks the giant king if he can marry his daughter, and the giant king, knowing that his daughter being married will kill him, sets him a series of impossible tasks. So Olwen asks King Arthur for assistance, and King Arthur just sort of agrees to help him because why not? And they set a series of challenges like beheading a giant, finding a giant cauldron. I think one of them was to rescue a dog from a underwater labyrinth. One was to cut the heart out of an enemy and eat it. And another one is they are forced to hunt and fight a giant magical boar that terrorizes South England and is eventually chased into the ocean. And at the end of the story, the Olwen goes to the king and he's like, "Have I not completed your list of impossible tasks?" He's like, "Yes, you have completed the impossible task." He's like, "So I can marry your daughter?" He's like, "Yes, you can." He's like, "Okay, thank you for giving your daughter to me in marriage." And the giant king responds, "Well, you should thank Arthur. Without him, you would not have been able to complete these tasks." That's all paraphrased, by the way, guys.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how much, and maybe one of you guys know, but I'm not sure how much of that actually parallels the actual trials of Hercules. But this idea of a quest of having like multiple different sort of larger than, any one task of which would be really larger than any single man is expected to be able to carry out, and just being given this sort of big long list to be sort of rewarded with something at the end. That does seem like an interesting sort of perennial tale. By perennial, I mean something that appears in multiple cultures. I have to wonder if it appears anywhere else as well. Again, like feel free to chime in if you know of any other examples of this kind of scheme cropping up in another culture.
I'm chiming in not because I necessarily know, I just am aware that I do believe that you can probably cherry pick a lot out of different cultures. I know they exist. I am 100% certain on that. And I also know, but as soon as you made that comparison and of saying like different impossible tasks, the thing I always find interesting is how the tasks always seem to revolve around different feats of the individual. It's not just, oh, the one defining factor is strength. It's like, no, there's always a task that's about how strong you are. Then there's a task about like how logical and methodical your thinking is, and then one that's a complete like curveball of now you've got to think completely laterally instead of logically.
I unfortunately don't know the specifics of the stories of the Mabinogion. I need to really focus in order to pronounce that right. I don't know the specifics of any of the stories. I only know an overview. Like I said, it was something I brushed up on just recently. But yeah, you're right. A lot of the trials that Hercules faces ultimately come down to him outwitting the challenge in some respect and thinking his way around it. Like cutting the head off the Hydra. He realizes that every time he cuts a head off, just two more grow. So he uses a torch to cauterize the wound shut before they can grow back. And another one of his challenges was to clean out a giant stable. And instead of just going in there and trying to clean it out, he digs a ravine into a trench from a river to the stable, so that the water will just wash it all away for him.
Yeah. So going back a bit, the other thing that's somewhat similar is, at least to me, it sounds similar, is the Epic of Gilgamesh has a similar sort of, what's the word? You've got a promised reward at the end of it, and you have to complete some form of impossible feat in order to get it. And I think yeah, they all sort of share this, I don't want to call it a central theme, but they all share similar plot points, as it were. Like a lot of it is based around finding someone that you've brought with you, giving the hero the ideas and giving them the help that they need in order to complete the task. It's not necessarily all the hero alone and their strength, and I think that's saying something about the sort of people and sort of civilizations that are coming up with these stories, is that their greatest heroes are accomplishing these tasks through like cooperation and having people around them that can help them. I don't think it's necessarily, this is sort of going more into specific myths, but I think it is, a lot of them are touching on similar things, and it's saying something about the cultures that are telling the tales.
The real treasure was the friends we made along the way.
Yeah.
I mean, in the case of making friends with King Arthur, then yeah, literally.
Yeah. So Epic of Gilgamesh, he had that's the name of the story. Sorry, but he had who was his name?
Enkidu.
Enkidu, that's the boy. And with Hercules, it was the idea to cauterize the wounds of cauterize the wounds after he's cut the Hydra's head off, was the servant, I think, or maybe it was just one of his friends.
I'm pretty sure it was Danny DeVito.
It was Danny DeVito himself.
God damn it.
But yeah, so this is maybe going on to a different topic, but it's sort of going onto more how you're processing and analyzing the myths to try and extract the cultural ideals and the ideals and morals of the society that's telling the tales. And obviously there's a lot of overlap between different societies, just because, well, at least in my opinion, the different societies are successful because they share some sort of value, and obviously cultural overlap from people to people, as it were. But a lot of it is just, it is a beneficial trait for a society to have, to encourage cooperation between its people.
Yes, so the idea that there is effectively a single mold, or at least a single space in which you can have a successful civilization, and therefore you get a filtering effect.
Yeah.
That would be one alternative, but I think there's another interesting way of looking at this, in that taking it into a slightly different direction of the flood, because the flood is another perennial, like the Great Flood is another perennial myth. There's a number of different ways that you could look at that, whether it's some kind of like cloudy memory of something that happened in the past, and there's a number of different sort of contenders for what that could be, what that event could be that was witnessed by really early humans, and they sort of remembered it and told tales about it, and gradually that made its way to us in various different more specific forms. Obviously, in a Western context, that's most notably the the Great Flood of Noah, of biblical fame. But there's another one that appears in Mesopotamian culture as well. I don't know if it was in the. I'm pretty sure it isn't in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but it's definitely in one of their other texts about. It appears in their mythology somewhere. I can't remember many more of the specifics.
It's mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So he meets a man who survived it.
Right, there we go. In that sense, you could be talking about less that the flood is some kind of like necessary component of grounding in civilization in any particular way, but more that all of these myths are some kind of like fuzzy memory of events from the far past. Because it's been remarked elsewhere as well how Jesus has a certain perennial aura around him, and some of the events that he some of his characteristics appear in other figures from elsewhere, with probably most notably I think it was Ahura Mazda in Zoroastrianism.
I feel like it's difficult to be specific with that because there were a lot of Jesus parallels at the time.
Yes. So
as weird as a sentence as that was to say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's some others as well in the sort of Mesopotamia region. There's at least one more around that area, and I think the cult of Mithras took on a very similar sort of dimension. So it might have been Mithras, but I think Mithras was sort of parallel with Jesus, whereas there was another one in Zoroastrianism. I think it was Ahura Mazda, but I might be mistaken, where he follows a lot of the same kind of trajectory, or it might have been Zoroaster himself. God, I'm going to need to brush up and add a bunch of things to the description because I'm not comfortable in any of what I'm saying. But point being, this kind of character and the kind of character that is described in all of these different stories that we're talking about elsewhere, with in the Welsh myth and in the Epic of Gilgamesh and wherever else that kind of like that quest appears as like a series of sequential, seemingly impossible tasks. That could be a fuzzy memory of something from our past.
While that is certainly a valid interpretation, just to play counterpoint, I would like to mention the whole idea of the hero's journey. This is a story structure that reoccurs over and over and over again in different civilizations. And
well, that's the point, though.
Coincidence is an element that is possible there.
Well, this is just pointing out that it has a perennial quality, not necessarily explaining why.
All right, yeah, this is sort of just...
Why does
it's
the hero's
not actually
tale...
a different argument, is it?
No, yeah, so why does the hero's tale have such a resonance with us?
I was also going to bring up the whole that there are only really 7 stories you can tell idea, but yeah. I don't really know enough about that to peg any significant meaning to it.
Remember, folks, originality is dead.
Always was.
So, Rupert.
Yes.
Do you not think, I know it's a great way of starting a sentence, do you not think that if you deconstruct the idea of a lot of these myths to just be a sort of shared perennial memory, that sort of ruins the whole point of having myths as a positive aspect of one's culture?
No, because there are different qualities and different sort of specific outcroppings that are probably quite telling of what the different outlooks are of the different cultures that are hosting them, let's say. Just one off the top of my head, the Welsh example versus the Greek example. In the Greek example, Hercules is very much set apart from the rest of the population because he has a divine lineage, whereas, to my knowledge, in the Welsh example, he doesn't necessarily. He's just a particularly noble man. And that's quite a noteworthy quality because that says something about how those two different populations perceive greatness, whether it's something that can only come from a divine source or whether it's something that we can embody just by being virtuous, basically.
I mean, isn't part of the Arthurian legend also the fact that he's sort of been chosen by God, so doesn't divinity sort of play in that a bit?
It does, but he's not fathered by God, like Hercules is.
So, yeah, okay. So, I agree that there are certain differences in how these myths are told, and I think those are definitely important distinctions to make when you're talking about and comparing the different cultures. But I wouldn't agree that saying, or I wouldn't go so far as to almost dismiss it as saying it's just a shared memory, because at least for me, part of the utility of, as potentially the title of this casual chat, the utility of the myth is in not necessarily acting as moral guidance, but as a sort of moral, giving people a moral framework for your future generations and having that continual oral tradition, which, thinking about it from a bit of a materialistic perspective, would give you the advantage over cultures that didn't do that because they didn't have the same shared timeline of their people, as it were.
Well, I suppose this would be where the limited malleability comes in. But sorry, go on, Simon.
I mean, to kind of counter that, I don't think. I mean, you guys are a lot more worldly than I am. I'll be perfectly honest. Like, my history is the history I know is very narrow in comparison to all of you. But I feel like to that end of of this myth forming your moral framework foundation, I don't think I've seen an example of not having one. I feel like every country, every culture has some sort of through line and timeline that they all follow that helps their foundation.
Okay, so this is again my sort of limited knowledge, but I'm not sure if it's just that.
Incidentally,
okay.
Is anyone going to speak from a position of confidence today?
No.
Anyway, go on.
So I can see a scenario, I'm not saying this is the case, where it is only those that have this cultural continuity through the oral traditions, and it's only those people that are able to continue on existing, or in that cultures and people that don't have that level of oral tradition just sort of get swallowed up by the cultures that do. Because obviously if you're not passing on your traditions, then someone who does is just going to teach you theirs.
When you put it in that terms, like if you're thinking of it evolutionarily as like a success between like the cultures that do have it are the ones that succeed and the cultures that do not. And painfully thinking about it now, I can see the modern equivalent where we're kind of seeing a lot of particular individual groups and beliefs sort of fall apart on themselves because they don't actually have that through line, like they've just abandoned it. And I can see that as like a form of natural selection, as it were. Like that's the reason why we don't see the unsuccessful ones, because they already died out, as it were. And you can kind of see the modern equivalent where we do have groups out there that seem to have abandoned that part of their tradition, and seeing them actively fail in real time, sort of like an evolutionary process going on, just on a cultural level rather than on a biological one.
Yeah, you can see, especially with the sort of black community where they had that physical disconnect with their homeland and their people there. How much of a disconnect that was, I'm not sure, but you can see them sort of struggling to find an identity, even if you want to take it in that direction.
Every podcast I'm learning that I should just be specific, because you're just going to bring up a specific group of people anyway, no matter what I try to do to skirt around it.
Yes. But this is the woke take, so it's fine.
Oh, I've got another pretty good woke take, or another woke example. In the case of the Easter Islanders, where they had their culture effectively destroyed by having all of the original sort of people who remembered all the songs and could read all the music and play all the music. Basically, everyone literate on the island, more or less, was taken away and enslaved and sort of taken to South America or Europe or just somewhere else off the island, and a lot of them died. So there was that just like very sudden break in the continuity of their culture, which is, from what I hear, especially devastating for anthropological studies, because they were one of the few cultures to develop a completely independent writing script. Sort of, they developed it on their own in isolation.
Now I just feel sad that we've lost that. That sounds really bad.
Yeah. But anyway, so the direction that I was going to take it earlier was there would probably be two ways in which this happens. Maybe three, I guess, if you add that sort of outside effect of someone coming in and physically removing all of the people who were transmitting all of that, myth and culture and all those oral traditions and oral histories and such. If all those people disappear, then obviously the culture can't transmit and it just dies there and then. But the main way that it seems to take place is by the over-rationalization, where there is a conscious effort to try and destroy the myths, because the myths are seen as not scientific or not like rational, not not accurate enough, and so you deconstruct it to try and find the specific truth at the core of it, and in the process you just you kill it, as though you're dissecting a frog. The other way that it happens would be, as you said, through the sort of imposition of a new set of myths that displays the old ones. And this is, I suppose, where we get into sort of my more original example, because what we're seeing, and I guess this sort of goes to an even more one phenomenon, that because we're so far removed from this example, we don't necessarily see it, but I think we currently have the example of the fascists and the Big H and World War II morality being overlaid over almost everything, especially political. In previous eras, the same applied to Napoleon and liberalism, where everybody was kind of using the French Revolution as that sort of touchstone, and almost everything that was being conducted in the sort of public sphere and the political sphere was being compared to what happened in those years and all of the outcomes. So Napoleon was not necessarily seen as the big bad. I suppose it'd be more like the rabble that was conducting the terror and all of the hyper rationalism that was trying to, and the cult of reason and all that sort of stuff that was going on in France during its most wacky period in the French Revolutionary period. That was being used as almost like a benchmark for chaos and evil, in the same way that the Big H and the mid 20th century Germans are now. But I think we're kind of starting to see that change again, so that the slaving empires, I suppose, the institutions that were involved with slavery are seen as like the perennial evil, I suppose, or the metaphysical evil, and that needs to be expunged, and the metaphysical good, like a good evil dichotomy. The good side of that is the civil rights people and all of that kind of movement that was associated with people like Martin Luther King. Those are the unquestionable goods, and you're not allowed to question them. And on the reverse side, you have the unquestionable evils, and you're not allowed to try and redeem them in any particular way.
So wait, have we gone slightly forwards to civil rights, or have we gone ass backwards here?
I'm saying that that's the newer story, the newer myth that's coming in, as of the last decade or so.
Okay, I was just a bit like, it felt like there was a bit of continuity in the sense of that it was based on something that is both old yet recent enough to not be remembered clearly, but recent enough that there is still aftershocks being felt from it.
That's the thing with the Germany example, is that in our transition to this new myth, we're not progressing chronologically, because we're looking back at, we partially are, but in terms of looking at the people in the UK, for example, who were involved with slavery, the trading of slaves, and then tarring the entire British Empire with that, or anyone who had any financial engagement with slavery at all, and calling them the unquestionable evil who you're not allowed to try and redeem in any way. That's a move back in time, but it is the new story.
Okay. I mean, to that end, I'm just going to come out with this, and that is, anyone who's listening to this, and if you think the British Empire was particularly evil, please look up the East India Company and all the shit they got up to, and then tell me whether or not you think the British Empire is evil. Thanks. Okay, thanks, bye.
I don't know. The East India Company was kind of based. I'm not throwing it under the bus.
They're basically like an 1800s umbrella corporation.
Well, I'm coming at this with the woke take, okay? So there you go.
So I think I do agree with your point there, Rupert, but I suppose the question that immediately springs to mind is that if there is this continuity of a cultural big bad and hero figure, as it were, so the examples you gave of civil rights and slavery and the Nazis, and wait, can we say that? I don't know. The N words.
Oh no!
Oh no!
But not those ones. Sure. The fascists, because you used that earlier, so that one must be safe.
Probably not, but whatever.
But so, is there not some level of continuity from the structure of having a big bad and a hero figure, and having that being the sole focus? So before you answer that, I do agree that there was definitely some disconnect with, I'll call them the old ways because it makes it sound cooler, and that we have definitely moved on. That's not a good way of phrasing it. We've left those behind, though you'll probably tell me when we've left those behind.
Left which behind?
The old ways.
Which old ways?
So
This whole sounding cooler thing really hasn't paid off, has it?
no, it really hasn't. So presumably there was a shift from the myths that we were talking about earlier with the Trials of Hercules and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and this more modern, I'll call it a tradition, of a more partisan, big bad, objectively good level of way of thinking about the world. So
I know what you mean, but I couldn't, off the top of my head, sort of pinpoint a time when that transition actually happened.
yeah, something to look up, but maybe it was because it's a more gradual shift.
It sounds like the kind of thing that would have been sort of ousted by sort of more Enlightenment ways of thinking, where you had that break at a point, and they started sort of trying to deconstruct all of the older stories, and then what made it through that were the older stories that continued on, and then in whatever space was left for the mythological in the minds of the people was then filled with newer myths. And then I suppose we probably still have waves of that, because there was also obviously the Romantic period where there was a lot of interest in sort of rediscovering and going back to try and find some of those older myths and older stories that had been seemingly lost. But unfortunately, a lot of the time they, I suppose, make the mistake in a certain way of trying to just write them all down. But in the process of writing them all down, they kind of kill them, really.
Yeah, I think once you've lost that continuity, it's very difficult for you to regain the same sort of cultural touchstones of your myths in general. This is going off on a slightly different path, perhaps, but so when you're looking at what we're getting with religion in the sort of modern day, with this massive wave of sort of the atheistic movements, I think you find that a lot of people struggle to come back to religion because they've spent so long not necessarily just deconstructing it, but deconstructing it with that temporal separation, that I think people do struggle with it.
It's not even a personal deconstruction, I wouldn't say, a lot of the time. Usually I think it's because it's been deconstructed in the public square so visibly. People find it hard to engage with sort of more Western spiritual practices, even if they feel the yearning for a spiritual practice, in which case they will turn to, if they're looking for a traditional spiritual practice, they'll probably go to something Eastern. And if they're looking for an atheistic spiritual practice, let's say, they get involved in one of the perhaps more metaphysical or metaphysically inclined ideologies that have appeared more recently, where they're making like huge metaphysical judgments about the world and about evil and about good and all that kind of thing, which is again what we're touching on.
Side note, if you're going to pick an Eastern religion, at least pick Shinto or something, not Buddhism. Buddhism is so pessimistically boring.
I don't know. Buddhism is it's pretty aware on the woman question, let's say that.
Yeah, but Shinto features rectal-based miracles. You can't really beat that.
You going to elaborate? Because I have no idea what you're talking about.
I've forgotten which Shinto god it was. It might have been Amaterasu, but basically she was able to produce a feast from her backside.
Lovely.
I am probably very wrong, and I have no confidence in what I just said.
It'll be in the description.
No, it won't.
So, going back a step then, I suppose, what do you think, Rupert, then, is the utility of the sort of modern mythological sphere, I suppose?
To whom?
That's a very good question.
Because my take on a lot of this kind of thing generally is that a lot of these stories are promulgated in a fairly aristocratic fashion, as in from the top down, mostly. So the myths that were being handed down now are a lot more cynical than ever before, because the people in the higher levels who are promulgating a lot of these myths are doing so via multiple levels of sort of corporate body, I suppose. And by corporate body, I mean, like some kind of organization. And that's filtered for very cynical aims. So if you're effectively filtering a myth through a political party or something, or like a pressure group, then it's probably going to be inclined very cynically. But then even the people who are kind of pushing it themselves, where it's more centrally dictated, it's more base. It just seems. Maybe there's some like higher plan in mind that I'm not privy to, but it just seems so much more vulgar.
More cynical.
Yeah, but also just aesthetically vulgar.
Mm. Do you think that that's different from some of the more classical myths?
Well, yes, because insofar as there's judgments of... So let's go back to the sort of good and evil dichotomy that's been appearing in some of the more recent myths, it seems. At least in a lot of the older myths, there are one of two things is happening. Either evil is treated as something that is not like a metaphysical quality in and of itself, by which I mean, that there is not just a substance out there of like evil or like an essence of evil, but instead evil is like some kind of corruption, and therefore anybody who is embodying that evil can be saved, basically. There's opportunity for the good to come along and to permeate them and to bring them back from the evil. That's kind of like more of the Christian take on it, I suppose. It varies a little bit, but definitely in the more modern iterations, I think there's definitely a lot more of that, especially when you're talking about the human subject. So people are seldom just like in Christianity considered intrinsically evil without redemption, or like without the possibility of redemption.
Yeah, I think a lot of if they do need that sort of plot point, as it were, they'll use a monster like St. George going and fighting the serpents.
Yeah. But the other alternative, as I sort of alluded to, is that if there is going to be this this entity of this essence of evil that exists out there, then it's like a non-human quality. It's something that exists as like an energy or something like that, which then kind of like comes and infects things, rather than it being a set of people that therefore need to be destroyed or something. Whereas in some of those more modern movements and in some of the more modern myths, we're treating people and groups of people as though they are the intrinsic evil that cannot be redeemed.
I feel like that happens just to remove the moral ambiguity.
Well, that gets back into the cynicism of the whole thing then, because if this whole thing is just to, like remove a group of people or something, then, well, yeah, that's either very cynical or that is evil in itself, insofar as something can be evil.
Me being me, I'd actually say it's definitely more the latter than the former. It's much easier to paint a villain for your story, to divide things into black and white, to motivate your followers into doing what you want them to do, and that the destruction of the other group may not necessarily be a means to its own end. It may just be a convenient scapegoat for them, as opposed to generally seeking the destruction of the other group. It's more like you could maybe see that as more just like the other group, this group is our enemy. Oh, they got destroyed. Well, that's too bad then, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I see where you're going with that. So it's more of a, so to be specific, which I know you don't like, it's a easy way of saying, okay, well, it's not our fault. It's the slaver's fault that this group of people are struggling.
I think the whole point is to just try and remove the ambiguity and to make you not think so hard about it, or because sometimes that's what I think can draw people to an idea sometimes, is when it's just easily digestible and you don't have to think too hard about the morality of it. You never have to look in the mirror and ask yourself, am I a bad person, etc., etc.
For me, what I'm understanding from this is that what we're getting to in the more modern context is more bipolar. That seems like a weird word to use. Good and evil, black and white. So in the more modern context, we have these more black and white, good and evil, mythological aspects to the society. Not necessarily actual myth, but stuff we're talking about with the slavery and civil rights movements.
Well, it's fulfilling the category of myth because it's often offering like half complete, like very low resolution histories and like descriptions of events that do not bear like really close scrutiny when you look at the details.
Yeah, so exactly, it's not exactly a myth, but it's scratching the same mental itch in the brain.
I think it probably falls into the category of myth, for me anyway.
Fair enough. But I suppose the distinction between the more modern and more classical myths and how they're used is that in the more modern context, they're used to target and ostracize a certain group of people and to gain something from them. So either to ostracize them or to demand reparations, for example. Whereas in the past, I think there was definitely room for that. Sticking with Christianity, you have the church themselves or the priests trying to gain from removing the sins from people. So forgiveness for people's sins through payment directly to the church. But there was more of a focus on trying to guide people to build a good moral character for themselves, rather than just trying to demonize a group of people. Am I right in that sort of summary, I suppose?
Yeah, I would say so. Were you going to build on that point?
No, I was trying to summarize it.
Okay.
just to make sure I was thinking of it in the right terms.
Yeah. Well, I'm drawing a blank, so maybe one of you could sort of fill me in on what an example might be. But I'm struggling to think of any of these sort of comparable examples where in the modern day we have a myth that is oriented towards providing people with virtue, I guess, or like giving an individual an outlet for being good, basically.
I suspect you're drawing a blank on account of the fact that, as we have already said, we live in a cynical age. There is what few modern myths, and I can't help but feel the term modern myth is in of itself a bit of an oxymoron, but still, let's stick with it. Those aren't being presented to us anymore. Modern myths are more about polarizing people. If you want a moral story or to seek an example of virtue, then you need to go back and look into your civilization's past for their myths to find that. If you want an example of virtue in the modern West, I would sooner point to the tales of King Arthur or Hercules before looking in the mythologized interpretations of things like the Second World War and slavery.
I think you're probably right, but I think it depends on what side of the political aisle you see yourself. So I think for the more woke crowd, you definitely have an idea of personally paying reparations or doing what you can to help, and through that making yourself a more just person.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I gave it a little bit of thought as you were explaining that, and I think looking at it from the perspective of like classical virtue, then yes, you're correct. But looking at it from the perspective of like what can you do to make yourself good, I think this like becoming an activist in whatever the newest sort of civil rights movement equivalent is your path to virtue in the modern myths. Except that takes on very much more of a cynical quality.
I was about to say, I don't think that really, even within that side of the aisle's own framework, I don't think that necessarily makes you a virtuous person. It's kind of just expected of you, and if you're not doing it, then you're a bad person just by default. Like, I feel like there's more reasons to be put into damnation than to ever be put into good graces in that current aspect of the modern myth. Although I also would like to point out that maybe that part of the reason of why we've got the current perspective, if we're using World War II as our current myth, if that's our current perspective on it, and the big H as we're calling it and all that, it's very much, to me, it's very much like we're taking only one perspective of it, and that since then the narrative has been very much controlled into this perspective of big H was bad, slavery was bad, civil rights good, etc. And we've just been railroaded into it without the other perspectives being allowed to be brought up, like anyone pointing out what good actually came from the 20th century and etc.
I suppose it's the problem with mythologizing something that is so recent, is that first of all it's too well documented to be mythologized. We know too much about what happened during the slave trade in the Second World War in order to properly mythologize it. Give it another few thousand years and have a couple of libraries burned down, and you'd probably have a better shot at that. But another interesting point looking at that is, in the mythologization of World War II, the stand-in for just pure evil that needs to be destroyed is just the big H and the Germans, and I'm just going to use the word the Nazis. Feel free to bleep that out. That's your pure evil, except there's a flaw with trying to portray men as pure evil, and that is you're stripping out their humanity. Like, okay, it's like you're saying, no, these aren't men who are doing their patriotic duty to serve their country. They're just pure evil. That's where the benefit of ancient myth comes into play. Like, Hercules isn't going around killing guys who are just trying to feed their family or whatever. He's killing monsters and demons and stuff. You
And
can't.
his own family.
Yeah, you can't. You can't portray the Hydra as actually secretly being the good guy. Like, he's just looking out for his snake friends or whatever, and thus, like Hercules killing the Hydra or King Arthur slaying the magical boar. Those are just unequivocally good things because they have destroyed monsters.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if you weren't aware of that, but part of the Hercules myth, or at least in some interpretations of it, he did actually kill his own family, so it's also kind of a redemption story.
Although, counterpoint, Kurtz, in line with the sort of some of the deconstruction sort of angle that we've been going down recently. Well, that is one of the things I would like to say as well, is that part of the reason why it's difficult to maintain some of these myths is also because we're in a very deconstructive age. So there is a great tendency for people to look back at some of these myths and say, yeah, did that actually happen? Are things actually like that? And kind of pull some whataboutism in regards to all of these different people who took part in who were unequivocally good but had all these bad qualities, or unequivocally bad but had all these good qualities, etc., etc.
Yeah, but these are the same assholes who ruined sci-fi films by going, actually, there's no sound in space, so there would have been no volume to that whatsoever.
Yeah, same phenomenon, same vibe, same energy.
So from my modern deconstructionist view, Hydras are real, Nazis are not.
That's not really deconstructionist at that point. It's
that's just wrong.
Anyway, but the other angle is that some of this stuff was kind of like embedded into the populations in other ways, like for example, I'm pretty sure the Thebans were treated as kind of like the big bad for Athens, and so because Athens has such a huge cultural impact, then we get more of their perspective than other comparable Greek powers, and so we get the sort of perception of the Thebans as being these sort of like big bads, and they're not quite evil per se, but they're like they're the antithesis of everything that Athens is, which is like liberty and goodness and prosperity and all that kind of thing.
I suppose that just gets folded into wartime propaganda. Every country that has ever gone to war has portrayed its other side as being against everything that they are for, and everything that they are for is, of course, good.
Yeah.
So that's just part of your war machine at that point.
Right, but this is the thing. This is where it gets folded into the sort of the whole myth thing, is because, I mean, I guess if you wanted to look to expand that example, then we are in a state of perpetual war against our own population. Or like, one segment of our population is perpetually at war with the other segment of our population, which is probably a very good description. It's a common sort of criticism of democracy, but or just like factionalism in general.
I just want a grill, man.
I don't know. You got any problem with that description, or do you think that's fair?
I'd say that's fair.
Well,
democracy is a country being at war with itself. That's kind of weirdly apt.
Perpetually. Hence why we're all propagandizing against each other. Well, on that depressing note.
Is that why we all have to propagandize against you?
Yes, I am the eternal perennial enemy of the rest of you. Anyway, we'll leave it there then. Bye.